Hey guys, Pro here, back with another video, another Let's Talk artifact, and today we are talking about control decks. We're looking at what we know so far, the mechanics, and we're talking about how they're going to be working, how they're going to function. Now, it may seem like baseless speculation, we only know some of the cards, but I don't actually think that's really how you analyze how control will work in a game. I actually think you need to really look at the mechanics, and we can see this by looking at games like Magic the Gathering and Hearthstone. We can see these rules and we can kind of make these connections to how the control decks actually tend to function. So just by looking at the mechanics, we can really get a good idea of how control decks might function. So before we get into my two kind of main areas, I just wanted to make a general point that actually is in favor of control decks that I actually haven't really seen mentioned anywhere. I could be wrong, maybe someone wrote a comment about it, but what I think is actually quite a big and really important part of Artifact is that these heroes start in the lane. Now, these heroes are actually quite powerful compared to the power level of early mana plays. You have stuff that can deal a few damage or move cards around that you'll often be playing in the first turn. But I'd say your hero, having the abilities of a hero and the stats of the hero, are actually worth a fair bit more than a lot of these early plays. So what that means is that, it's very, very silly to say and try and put a number on it now, but let's say a hero is worth 4 mana. So each player starts with 12 mana in play. Now, if your opponent spends 9 mana, by using all their mana in every lane in the first turn, and you use 3 mana, well, it's like 15 to 21 mana spent. And, sure, they've spent 6 mana more, but ratio-wise, you're not that far behind. Now, let's compare it to something like Hearthstone, where if my opponent uses all 6 mana in the first 3 turns of the game, and I use 2 mana, well, they've used 3 times as much mana. They have 3 times as power spent on the game as well, and that actually does put me further behind. So I think this is something that could favor control decks and slower games where the explosive starts don't count for as much and they don't decide as many games because you already have this certain value worth of mana in play that makes this ratio of mana efficiency a lot worse. So it's something I want to see. Let me know your thoughts about that. I'm surprised it hasn't really come up, but I do think it is actually very, very relevant. I mean, it might be said, I do check the Reddit like 3 times a day, so I haven't seen much about it. Anyway, let's get into my two main areas I want to talk about when kind of evaluating and coming to conclusions about how control decks will function in Artifact. So there's two main areas I want to focus on, and that is how removal heavy decks are, and at the same time how threat light they are, how few win conditions, how few just generic creatures that win the game they'll run. So we have two spectrums to compare stuff to, that is Magic the Gathering, where we often have decks that are just creatureless and just full of removal spells and counter spells. And then we have something like Hearthstone, where because there's no instant speed interaction, you have to run a certain amount of creatures, less removal, more win conditions. You need to be a bit more proactive with your control deck. You can't just simply exhaust your opponent out of resources. So we have some stuff to compare it to, and by looking at the rules of these games, we can actually see why these things are, and therefore we can make some conclusions and speculate on how Artifact control decks are going to work. So the first point that I want to talk about with regards to how removal heavy decks will need to be is that the hero system can inherently lead to less of a need for win conditions, and that is simply because your heroes can serve as win conditions that you get for free essentially because they just start the game and play. You don't have to pay mana for them. So if you can use your heroes to win the game, well, suddenly the rest of your deck can be solely dedicated to your game plan of controlling your opponent, playing removal spells, gaining card advantage. And it's a very, very big factor when you're playing a control deck is you actually want to run as few win conditions as you need to. Because your win conditions don't actually win you the game in the fact that they get you ahead. What they really do is you win the game with your removal spells and your card advantage, and then you execute this win, you demonstrate this win by playing your win condition when the game's kind of already over. So less of a need for win conditions is definitely a positive in the favor of control decks. Now, another favor that kind of goes a little bit both ways with our removal heavy decks is the priority system. Now, Artifact uses an instant speed interaction system where you're constantly going back and forth. I play a card, you play a card, I play a card, you play a card. And I think any system with constant instant speed interaction is inherently going to lead to decks being able to play more reactively. And that is because you can instantly respond to your opponent's threats. If they play something that's going to attack immediately, then you can deal with it before it deals damage to you, or you can deal with it before it gets out of hand. It's pretty simple to see, and that's one of the biggest complaints about Hearthstone is the instant speed interaction, so your opponent can play a charged creature, hit you in the face, and deal a lot of damage and get some value before you even have a chance to interact with it. So because we have this instant speed priority system, there is more room for more reactive plays. Now, compared to Magic the Gathering, I actually do think this system leads a little bit less towards reactive decks, and the reason for that is the lack of phases in the game and the ability to pass the turn and stop your opponent from using their plays. So the best way to illustrate this is really just with an example. So let's pretend I'm going through a game of Magic and I'm going through a game of Artifact. And both of these games, I'm a control deck. I just want to kill my opponent's creatures and get as much value as I can. And I have a removal spell that kills everything, and they have a creature in board at the start of the turn. Now, in Artifact, let's say I'm going first, and this is really when the problem comes up. I can use my removal spell on my opponent's creature, but if I do that, then I don't get the chance to respond to whatever they play next, and they might play something much better that I'd much rather use the removal spell on. So if I pass, because I want to see what his creature is, then he can just pass to get an attack him with his creature on the board, and I haven't actually used my mana, and I might want to use my mana. I haven't used this removal spell, and they can play the threat in another lane, or they can hold on to it, or they can just play the threat, and the same thing basically happened as if I was doing second, but they had that choice. And giving your opponents choices when they otherwise wouldn't is inherently a bad thing in any card game, assuming you're versing someone who's going to make the right decisions, or even close to making the right decisions half the time. So that's something we don't really like, but that's only going to be happening some of the time where you're going first in the lane, and it's actually quite possible to play around it, as we talked about in my last Let's Talk Artifact video, of intentionally passing when you otherwise wouldn't, in situations where this would be important. Now, this problem doesn't exist in Magic the Gathering, because if I pass the point to my opponent, they start the turn with their creature, well, if they don't play a creature to stop me from removing whatever they want to play, well, then I can just use my removal spell at the end of the turn and kill their creature on board, and they don't get another chance to play that creature because it's past their main phase, so I end up clearing the board. Or they play their creature, and now I see what two creatures he's played, and I get to choose which one I want to use them. The fact that we can do things at the end of our opponent's turn in a phase where they can't then play a creature, that is a massive difference making it. And it's something that can definitely hurt reactive decks, but it's definitely not a major issue. We'll see how that one plays out. So another thing I want to talk about, which I think is actually kind of a bit of a detriment to these super reactive decks, at least decks that want to play multiple colors when they're being super reactive, is the way that the color and lane system work to allow opponents to play around spells quite effectively. Now, once again, I'm going to give an example. I think it's the best way to illustrate this. Let's say that I'm the aggro player. I have a 3/3 I can play, and I have a 4/4 I can play. Now, I know my opponent has a red hero in one lane, and I know he often plays a card that's a red card that deals 3 damage to a creature, and I know he's also playing a black card that can kill any creature, and he has a black hero in the other lane. Now, I'm obviously going to realize this if I'm a good player, and I'm going to put the 4/4 in the lane with a red hero. So now if he deals 3 damage, it doesn't kill it, and I'll put the 3/3 in the lane with the black hero, because if he uses his catch-all removal spell, well, he would much rather do it on the 4/4, but it's in the wrong lane. So that's something that he can't actually do. Obviously, there will be some cards that affect multiple lanes, but when we're just dealing with cards that only affect one lane, it's actually quite a big shortcoming. And it's hard enough as a control deck, a super reactive control deck, to line all your threats up against opponents that are attacking you from a bunch of different angles. In Magic, you have planeswalkers, you have to deal with small creatures and big creatures and flying creatures. You need different answers for all these different things. And in Artifact, if similar things exist where there's lots of different ways to attack you, then not only do you have to have the right cards to line up with it, well, suddenly you need to have a hero in that lane with that color, and they need to play that card in that lane. So that can actually be a real issue. We'll see how that one lines up. From a purely skill-based looking strategical way, I think this is good news for the game. It actually creates a lot of decisions where I have more ways to play around my opponent's cards, and they can try and set up scenarios where their spells will play favorably into that. So, you know, maybe they play a 4/8 into the lane I would want to play my 4/4 in. Suddenly that's, you know, a worse exchange for me. And this is not... I want to make it clear that this is not to talk about how strong control is necessarily going to be, because it entirely depends on how well they print control decks and the cards. But it does help us kind of talk about how they're going to function, what they're going to be composed of, And if these factors that work badly against reactive cards, we may see less reactive cards and more slightly proactive or more catch-all threats that we can kind of play in advance. So that's just something to consider. I want to make that clear. Another quick thing is we haven't seen any counter spells or similar effects so far, and I don't expect to really see many, if any, because the reason that I don't think it will work is that it just doesn't really work within the priority system. The way it works is you play your card and then the effect resolves and then they get priority. So let's say I just have a creature that deals damage when I come into play. Now if I have the chance to counter spell it, well, it's already resolved, it's already in play. So what are they going to then lose? The card's going to go to the graveyard, no abilities will trigger, the damage gets undone. Or if there's a random effect, it's even worse, you know the RNG now. That's not something I really see happening. There may be a couple similar effects, but I don't think we'll see counter spells that are really anything too similar to Magic the Gathering, and definitely not in the same amount of frequency. And that is something that does hurt potential super reactive decks where you're just playing only removal and counter spells, because those have always kind of been a crutch of Magic the Gathering and the way that these reactive decks have worked. So that's something to keep in mind. So the next kind of broad topic of stuff I want to talk about is the win condition, how the game actually wins and how this interacts with the lane system. And one thing that works well for control decks is that in a normal game where your opponent is, where you're both trying to win 2 out of the lanes, you have this option to lose one lane, and as long as you just lose that lane, you actually weren't punished at all, even if you didn't spend really any resources in it, as long as they don't go super hard on the one lane and then kill the Ancient. But this actually does work really, really well for control decks, because we want to use our resources as efficiently as possible, and playing a super reactive deck, often a problem with that in something like Magic the Gathering is eventually you have to respond to all of your opponent's threats. If they play a 2/2 and keep beating you down, sure, it may take 10 turns to kill you, but eventually they're going to deal 20 damage with it. At some point you have to deal with it, and that's not something you want to do. You don't want to deal with these small threats. You want to use your removal on a 2/2. In Artifact, because we can kind of lose one lane, we don't really have to worry about these small insignificant creatures, because they're not really going to kill the Ancient. They may kill the tower eventually, but by then the game is well over. So it gives us the ability to ignore these small threats. And at the same time, a good player who can adapt, not only just these small insignificant, turn 1 plays, it can be very powerful creatures that your opponent may spend a lot of mana or resources on. But if these creatures don't actually present a fast clock, well, suddenly you can ignore them, and the value they generate may be like killing a creature every turn. That is ignored because all that matters in a lane that's being ignored is how fast it kills the tower. That's what matters. So say they just play a low attack creature that generates another small amount of value each turn, but it doesn't present a fast clock. That's something you can ignore, and you can make that switch mid-game. Okay, now that's the lane I'm going to ignore. Let's put the resources into these other 2 lanes and make sure we win those, because we don't have to worry about that lane. Let's just make sure we win these 2 lanes. So something to consider. I think it will be some really interesting choices for control decks, and it does allow them to be more reactive because they're not stuck just tunnel visioning, I have to win these 2 lanes. They're able to react even to what lanes they want to win, and that's something really, really cool. Another thing I want to talk about, and I really kind of hope this is the way it plays out, and I hope this is kind of something that exists, because I think it's really, really interesting interaction, and that is that some heroes, when they're alone in a lane, and your opponent is also just leaving that lane alone, and it's just like kind of hero versus hero combat, some heroes are going to be inherently much, much stronger in that situation. And what that can mean is, if you can kind of create these scenarios where you have one of these strong heroes that works really well when it's just left alone, and they want both players to leave it alone, if you can create scenarios where all the action, all the resources are being spent in the other 2 lanes, that's really, really good for you, because as the game continues on, assuming all else is equal, you're gaining an advantage in this 3rd lane, and eventually you can slowly kind of convert that to a win. Now, how can a control deck actually make advantage of this? Surely your opponent, being the aggressive player, they're kind of dictating what lanes is being played because they're the ones playing the threats. And sure, this is the case. However, the existence of these kind of like utility heroes that we've seen, stuff like gaining mana back, but only being like a 2/5, I think that's a Luna. That's something that your opponent is inherently going to want to attack. They're easy targets, they're constantly generating value for you, and they're really easy to kill. So your opponent is going to want to put resources into lanes and get you off these utility heroes. And what that will mean is that they leave this kind of lane with this really strong hero alone. And that is something that you can do. Your win condition stops being something like, okay, I get to turn 10. If they can't remove this, then that wins the game. Where it's more, I'm gaining this little bit of advantage every time the turn goes on, in addition to just being a control deck. So, you know, 10 turns of being left alone, these two heroes in the lane, I'm going to actually get really far ahead. So that's something to consider, and different compositions interacting with these utility and these powerful standalone heroes can actually really help the control player get back some of the advantage they lose by being the reactive deck. Obviously, the proactive deck, they're the ones playing the threats, they decide what the lanes are going to be, but your hero strategy can really dictate that and kind of get that back in your control. And I talked about this before, but the less of a need for win conditions because you have these heroes, and it's a free avenue. Now, another way that really determines the win conditions and just the general gameplay is the way that gold works in the game. So you get 2 gold for killing creep and 5 gold for killing a hero. Now, if you're playing a deck that's not generating creeps, essentially like a creatureless deck, then, well, that's something your opponent's not getting. It's a resource you're not getting access to. And if you're killing their creeps, well, you're getting gold for yourself. So you're kind of blocking off this this avenue of gaining resources for them. And maybe they want to be getting items. Maybe they're a deck that centers around killing their opponent's cards, so they get gold and get these really powerful items that they can equip. And at the same time, you can also be gaining gold. If you're just playing a bunch of sweepers, well, sure, you might be falling a bit behind, but you're the only one really getting a lot of chances to generate gold, aside from just the regular hero spawns. So that's something to consider. But at the same time, control decks are typically behind in the early game. And if you're behind in the early game, your opponent's going to be killing your stuff, you're going to be killing your heroes, and be getting gold, which can serve as a snowball effect. So it goes both ways, but it will be interesting to see how decks tend to attack this method of denying your opponent chances to get gold, aside from just the heroes, by not playing creeps and stuff that gives your opponent more chances to earn gold while getting this gold for yourself. And that'll depend on the items, how people will play around with it. But it's definitely something to consider. It can really go both ways, the way the gold mechanic works, and depending on deck compositions and the way matchups play out and strategies, the gold system can either be a positive thing for your control deck or can be a really, really bad thing where you're kind of giving your opponent free resources. It makes stuff like chump blockers bad, and defenders that, you know, they live a turn but they don't really do anything then and they get killed. So that's something to definitely consider, and we'll see how that plays out. So overall, I do think that there will be a lot of room for some fairly reactive decks. I think it will be slightly less reactive than in Magic the Gathering, but much more reactive than in Hearthstone potentially, depending on the cards that get printed, obviously. And I think at some point, obviously, we will have viable control decks. That kind of happens in every game. But you can definitely see that there's a lot of room for control. The game mechanics are really, really interesting. And this is just another reason why I'm so excited for the game. In that every mechanic you can look at, okay, well, this helps them in this way if you play around this way. Or this could help the aggro player, this could help the control player. This hero system can work in this way. Who gets to dictate which lane we play in. All these super interesting things. So let me know, what do you think? How do you think control decks will function? Let me know in the comments below or on the Reddit thread. I'm really, really interested to see, because it's not something I've seen discussed too much. Now, if you like this video, feel free to like and subscribe. I do appreciate it. And please do let me know if you want to see more of these kind of videos and what topics you want me to cover. I really, really enjoy talking about this game. Since I can't play it, you know, it's all I think about. I'm constantly checking Reddit and all that. I'm really excited for this game, so I love talking about it. I love creating content for it. So if there's more you want to see, please do let me know. Alright guys, that's all. I will see you next time. Thanks for watching.